Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are thrilled tonight to be here with our old school, longtime friend, Moya Bailey, celebrating her brand new book, Misogynoir Transformed, Black Women's Digital Resistance. We are here with her friend and colleague, Catherine Knight Steele. And I'm going to introduce both of them. But first, we also just want to thank our friends at ZAMI NOBLA. Thanks to Marianne Adams and everyone with ZAMI. ZAMI is a longtime friend and partner organization of Charis, longtime friend of Moya's. So this was a really lovely opportunity for us to join forces and celebrate Moya's work. So I'll be dropping a link to ZAMI in the chat in just a minute. But if you don't know about ZAMI's work, please check that out. And support their work wherever possible. So first, I'm going to introduce Catherine Knight Steele. Catherine is an assistant professor of communication at the University of Maryland in College Park and was the founding director of the Andrew W. Mellon-funded African American Digital Humanities Initiative. She earned her PhD in communication from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and her research focuses on race, gender, and media with a specific focus on African American culture and discourse in traditional and new media. She examines representations of marginalized communities in the media and how groups resist oppression and utilize online technology to create spaces of community. Dr. Steele's research on the Black blogosphere, digital discourses of resistance, and digital Black feminism has been published in such journals as Social Media Plus Society, Information and Communication in Society, and Television and New Media. Dr. Steele argues that online practices of joy, gossip, signifying, and play are integral to understanding Black discursive practices online. Her forthcoming book with NYU Press, Digital Black Feminism, which we're going to get a pre-order link for you very soon from Charis, examines the relationship between Black feminism and technology as a centuries-long gendered and racial project in the U.S., with implications on the future for both Black feminist rhetoric and as potentially the most generative way to understand the possibilities and constraints of digital technology. So welcome, Dr. Steele. We're thrilled to have you here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And the person of the hour, Dr. Moya Bailey, is an assistant professor of Africana Studies in the program in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Northeastern, but soon to be going to Northwestern. Her work focuses on marginalized groups' use of digital media to promote social justice as acts of self-affirmation and health promotion. And she's interested in how race, gender, and sexuality are represented in media and medicine. Bailey currently curates the #TransformedDH Tumblr initiative in digital humanities. She is also the digital alchemist for the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network. She's an MLK visiting scholar at MIT for the 2021 academic year, or was, I guess. You're wrapping up right now. And her books include the co-edited work, #Activism, Networks of Race and Gender Justice, and the book we are here to celebrate tonight, Misogynoir Transformed, Black Women's Digital Resistance. So I want to welcome you all who are watching with us tonight. If you would like, please shout out where you're watching from. We love to know where folks are coming from. If you are a longtime fan or friend of either of these folks, please feel free to shout that out. We love Fandom in the house as well. And the last thing I'll say is we really love your questions. So if you would like to put a question in the ask a question box at the bottom center of your screen, feel free to do that at any time. That's not disruptive. We'll wait towards the end to get to those questions, but feel free. And if there's a question that is similar to one you would like to ask, please just upvote the existing question so we can avoid redundancy. I think that is all that I am here to say. So I'm going to get out of the way and let's get this wonderful conversation going. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Moya.
Hello.
Oh, I want to thank you for inviting me to be here with you on this really extremely exciting day.
Thank you.
The book is out. It's so beautiful.
Thank you. I'm so happy with the cover.
It's gorgeous. I feel like it's very reminiscent of like a Pat Hill Collins Black feminist thought, like the words, the ideas at the center. I think it's perfect.
Yes, I definitely felt like, and the color scheme to me was giving a little Toni Morrison Song of Solomon kind of. So I'm feeling very very excited about the colors as well. Oh, and also this bridge a little bit. So I like being in that color family.
I love it. I love it. Well, I would love for you to start by reading some for us. Would you
I
grace
would
us?
love to. And I'm going to start with the preface because the preface really situates how the book came to be in the fabulous city that is Atlanta, Georgia. And I am joining you all from land traditionally stewarded by the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, and the Pawtucket. And Atlanta as a place is home to so many different Indigenous communities and Black folks that really informed how I was thinking about this work, and specifically Charis as an interlocutor, ZAMI as an interlocutor, and Spelman College. And one thing I will say is it's so interesting to think about your life as you go through it, because I've known Marianne as part of ZAMI for a very long time. And I remember being young and feeling myself and being like, I am a queer Black woman. I don't know about this lesbian thing, but I am queer and very proud of that. And now reflecting and being like, oh my gosh, I was just a young person doing too much. And Marianne was so graceful. Had so much grace and was like, okay, young one, do what you do. And I'm in a similar place where I'm seeing the young people and having that same, well, I don't know how Marianne felt. I don't know if Marianne felt like, oh, this child, but that's how I feel now. So all to say that I want to start at the beginning for me, which is Atlanta and Spelman. So this is the preface. Although I did not know it at the time, I started writing this book as an undergraduate at Spelman College. I was on the road to becoming a medical doctor when two things happened that made me shift course. I fell in love with women's studies, and I got international attention as one of the leaders of a small pushback on campus against the rapper Nelly. Both events profoundly shaped my thinking about the way Black women are treated in society and moved me to coin the term misogynoir, which in turn led to this book. As a first-year student from tiny Fayetteville, Arkansas, I was appalled when Dr. Beverly Guy Sheftall told the Spelman College entering class of 2005 about Sarah Bartman's experiences as a human exhibit in Europe during the early 19th century. Bartman, a young Khoisan woman from what we now recognize as South Africa, was displayed throughout Europe to paying white audiences as an example of the animalistic and inferior nature of the African woman. Implicit in Bartman's display was a comparison between her body and that of the white women who viewed her. European scientists equated Bartman's anatomical difference with sexual deviance, drawing conclusions about her sexuality and subsequently the sexuality of Black women from her form. Her butt and genitalia were used to justify racist and sexualized violence, as well as the continued enslavement of Africans in the quote-unquote New World. Dr. Guy Sheftall explained that the exploitative way Bartman's body was treated in life and in death was made possible under the guise of objective science, though what Bartman actually endured was objectification through scientific racism and sexism. In my first week at Spelman, before I had even attended a class, Dr. Guy Sheftall had challenged my thinking by describing the differential treatment Black women experienced on a global stage. After that moment, I knew I wanted to take every class I could with her. I was awakened to the profundity of the unique nexus of experience that is Black and woman on this planet and throughout colonial history. Along with enrolling in Dr. Guy Sheftall's classes, I took classes with fellow feminist professor Dr. M. Bahati Kaumba, or as we called her, Dr. K, who gave me the final nudge into the open arms of the comparative women's studies major at Spelman. As I was matriculating, I also got involved in the feminist political organizations on campus, all of which were supported by the Women's Research and Resource Center, the home of the Comparative Women's Studies Department. It was Dr. K who asked, "You're taking all the classes, why not be a major?" And when she put it that way, there was really no room for a rebuttal. But in truth, I was a willing convert, despite still having every intention of attending medical school, though that was not to be. As a 19-year-old junior and then president of the Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance, I showed the group Nelly's music video for the song Tip Drill, which had started airing on the late-night television show BET Uncut. The video featured most memorably a scene where Nelly slides a credit card down the crack of a Black woman's butt. Our group decided to name him our Misogynist of the Month, not knowing that the Spelman Student Government Association had agreed to partner with Nelly and his foundation to hold a bone marrow registration drive on our campus in an effort to save the life of his sister, who had leukemia. FMLA raised questions about the misogynoir in his video and lyrics, and when we heard that Nelly was invited to campus, it seemed only fair that we ask him about the way he represented Black women, since he was asking us for help. Nelly declined our offer to talk about his music. Instead, he went to the press, twisting the story such that it seemed that Spelman canceled the bone marrow registration drive because of the video, an assertion that many still believe today, though we orchestrated our own drive. The story garnered national and eventually international headlines, both praising and condemning Spelman students for daring to talk back to the music. It was a hard lesson in the hypervisibility and invisibility of being a Black woman. Nelly felt entitled to our assistance with saving his sister's life, but did not feel that he had to address us, the Black women who dealt with the fallout of his video and lyrics in our everyday lives. As young Black women, we felt the impact of the video and lyrics in the form of street harassment in the United States and abroad. We dealt with assumptions about our sexual availability to men in the form of unsolicited commentary on our bodies, on our clothing, and on our time. He used his celebrity built on the bodies of Black women to urge people to support an underappreciated cause, the health of Black women. Black women are far less likely to find a matching bone marrow donor than their white woman counterparts, in part because of Black people's deep distrust of the systemic racism in medicine, which makes them less likely to volunteer to donate. What was not quite clear to me in 2004 was the irony of using a fame garnered through limiting representations of Black women while refusing to address that decision and also wanting support from those very same Black women. I wasn't quite able to connect the dots between popular media representations of Black women and my and other Black women's experiences with discriminatory housing practices, intimate partner violence, street harassment, employment discrimination, and ill treatment from healthcare providers. But my interest in the role media plays in shaping the perceptions of Black women became all-consuming, such that the goal of becoming a medical doctor morphed into getting a doctorate to investigate the role representations play in the treatment of Black women patients by white doctors. I learned about the ways historical popular culture seeped into the consciousness of supposedly objective future physicians, which prompted me to consider how popular culture representations influence Black women's treatment in society and medicine today. It was in writing that dissertation that I landed on the word misogynoir to describe the particular venom directed at Black women through negative representations in media. How do you describe the ways that Black women are uniquely denigrated because of their gender and race? I played with a couple of terms before landing on misogynoir, and initially the term only existed in my dissertation until 2008 when I was invited to join the Crunk Feminist Collective, or CFC, an online blogging community of feminists of color. From 2008 to 2013, the CFC dominated the think piece blogosphere with insightful and pithy commentary on popular culture, primarily through the lens of hip-hop feminism. At its height, the CFC blog was home to 14 Black and feminist of color bloggers who wrote about the news of the day, paying special attention to highlight the intersection of race and gender in their writing. Founded by Black feminist scholars Brittany Cooper and Susanna Morris, then graduate students at Emory University in Atlanta, the CFC bridged a seemingly contradictory love for crunk hip-hop music that dominated the radio airwaves in the aughts and the feminist theory they were learning in grad school. The blog was a space for timely and incisive criticism, and my first post, They Aren't Talking About Me, discussed my concern about my own apathetic response to misogynoir in music. It was the word's first appearance outside of my dissertation. And once I used the word, other members of the collective started to use the term and appeared in more CFC posts. From there, some members of the blogosphere began to use it, but no one more compellingly than womanist blogger Trudy at her now sunsetted Gradient Lair. Her work introduced online communities to the word, and she deftly articulated its utility. Her work and others helped the term reach a wide range of audiences, including an international one. When I coined the term, I did not expect it to go viral. In addition to appearing in the New York Times, Ebony, Essence, and the Washington Post, Misogynoir has its own Wikipedia entry, which receives thousands of views every day. It is also referenced in numerous scholarly journals, articles, and monographs. The adoption of the term and its wide reach in digital spaces make further theorization of its use important for gender, critical race, and cultural studies audiences outside of the academy. I hope that in addition to creating a term that is useful, I have created a book that is useful to the communities with which I study. I hope that future efforts similar to the successful campaigns and actions I describe here will further improve the lives of Black women and their communities. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for starting us off by giving us your voice and giving us that background on how the term came to be. I think it's so, I wanted to start before you even said you were going to read the preface, because when I picked up the book for the first time, it felt like a moment, the same kind of moment of like Crenshaw and intersectionality, and Patricia Hill Collins and the Matrix of Domination, Alice Walker and womanism, Joan Morgan and hip hop feminism. And I just feel pretty confident in saying that this term, this idea, will have the same kind of staying power that these other terms have had for us as feminist thinkers and writers. So it feels like we have a really special moment to actually talk to someone through the thinking up of this term that I didn't have the privilege of doing with these other. So I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about what it's been like to watch this grow and watch this become something that other folks are taking up both inside and outside of the academy.
Oh, thank you for that. It's been such a wild ride. So like intersectionality, I think misogynoir names something that, Black feminists have been talking about for a long time. So the term itself is useful, I think, in collapsing and condensing conversations that have been there. But it's building on a legacy that Black feminists before me have really set. And in that way, I feel like, one, inspired that it is so useful, that I was able to plug into that legacy. And I very much feel like I am a part of that. And also then it's, super weird and awkward that the word is used so much, because it's not a pleasant thing to talk about. And so that it is reverberating with people and also increasing in its profile is a little disturbing, honestly, because it means that the way Black women have been treated and are being treated is still something that urgently needs to be addressed. And one part of this that's been important to me has been to name that I came up with it as a graduate student to remind people, that this isn't some extra special knowledge that a quote unquote scholar, I wasn't a scholar then, right? I was a scholar in training. So there's something really important to me about the fact that it's circulated most frequently and most heavily in digital spaces by other Black women, by non-binary, gender folks who found the term useful in describing their lives. And that energy then allowed it to be picked up and then seen as important to the Academy. I honestly think that if I hadn't blogged about it, if it didn't have a web presence, it might just have been stuck and lost in the dissertation. Because who reads those? Nobody reads those.
And hopefully not, right? No, I mean, I think that's such an, I get excited when people talk about their blogging days. And I think you're so right. I mean, what Crunk Feminist Collective did and the world of online writing that introduced so many Black women to, and so many non-binary folks too, was this space where we could actually think together collectively and kind of separately also from the folks who are usually there to disparage and to, and so blogging was such this magical thing. It felt like for such a period of time, this enclave kind of space. I want to come back and talk about blogging in a little bit, but can I ask a question about digital circulation that you just mentioned, and jumping right into the intro of the book? You talk a lot about Black women's bodies and bodies not belonging to us, and they're constantly being seen as belonging to other folks, and this subtle pressure, I think you're right, a subtle pressure to not only be useful, but to explain ourselves. This is such a powerful and historically grounded line in the book. I love this, right? Because you go into detail how everyone in society seems to carry an entitlement to the bodies of Black women. I'd love us to connect this to our current social media world and, beyond stereotypes and representation. How do you see Black women in online spaces continuing to feel this pressure to be useful in that digital context? And where are the pressures coming from now in a moderated kind of social media space?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think that there's definitely a way that Black women are expected to be in a position of facilitating, in that whether spoken or not, your needs are not the needs that are prioritized. It's the labor that you're doing for other people that helps make a space survive or exist in so many ways. And, a lot of people don't sign up for that. A lot of people don't consent to that. And, some of my early writing about Black women in digital spaces was looking at the real problems that journalists and academics were, the real mistakes that they were making in terms of engaging Black women's digital content. And so prime example that I'm thinking of are these BuzzFeed listicles, and, BuzzFeed, taking up a particular hashtag that was trying to address Black women's experiences with sexual assault and sexual violence. And while it was public, because of course Twitter is public, it's a very different thing when those tweets get aggregated into a BuzzFeed listicle. And so people's words were then amplified in a way that they did not consent to, and, had consequences for those people that they did not want. And for me, that was a real moment in thinking about how Black women's words are not their own. They're just up for grabs. We can just take it and we can use it. And so for myself in writing this book, I did a lot in terms of thinking about consent and engagement with people. So I wanted to give people the option to say no. You know, if I use somebody's handle, I reached out and said, you know, I'm writing this book. I'm planning to quote your handle. If you prefer I didn't, I'm happy to use a pseudonym. And this was a practice that was actually developed when Sarah J. Jackson and Brooke Foucault Wells and I were working on hashtag activism. So trying to remember that these are people, and that these are people who are living and negotiating life, and that what happens when you remove the context of somebody's work means that it can have a different power, which is great for, you know, you as an author or as an academic, a journalist, etc., but it may not be so great for them. So making sure that they get to be a part of the process, I think, is really one of the ways that I try to challenge that assumption that we are just useful to others.
I love that praxis, because it's not simply about like what you're doing for the book, but it's also a way of challenging this overarching concept about who words belong to and who ideas and thoughts belong to. Because I am a nerdy academic, can we talk a little more about method and ethics? Because I love the practices that you name in the book about who you'll cite and how you'll cite them, and referencing kind of developing that in collaboration with other folks, which I think is so important and so interesting. Did you receive any pushback from anyone as you were thinking about this practice, not just for the book, but I know a lot of us have these conversations about whether we're going to hyperlink to tweets, whether we're going to post the direct, you know, URL that we got a certain Facebook post or Instagram post from. So how did you go about developing that and being confident to say, hey, this is my ethical practice and how I plan to manage this going forward, especially because you've done work with large Twitter data sets as well. So how do you balance that?
I think writing the hashtag activism book gave me such a good practice. And Sarah and Brooke had already developed a practice since they had worked together on some articles looking at the hashtag MyNYPD, which, if you don't remember, was a hashtag that the New York Police Department created as like a public relations effort. Like, you know, tweet your favorite photos of you with the New York Police Department. And of course, people took it over and tweeted all of the ways that the New York Police Department was incredibly abusive and incredibly racist. And in that process of working on the articles that came out of that research, they decided that they would not reference any tweets that had been taken down since they had been collected in their sample. So there are several times, because of how we collect Twitter data, or could collect Twitter data at the time, which unfortunately in a lot of ways we can't do in the same way now because of how proprietary Twitter is. But they made a decision that even if it was in the data set, if it wasn't on Twitter now, the person had taken it down or deactivated their account, they wouldn't use that information. And I followed the same practice with mine. If the tweet was taken down, if there wasn't, if the person didn't exist anymore, then I didn't include it in the project.
That makes a lot of sense. I always think it's so helpful, you know, when folks are talking about their work, that we have like at least a minute to talk through that, because it's the question I feel like grad students ask, probably you and me the most, is always like, well, how do you actually do this thing? You know, what's the right way to go about it? And I love your description of that long kind of ethical process that you go through to think through how to not cause harm to folks who are really experiencing that.
Yeah. And, you know, that also makes me think of, even before the hashtag activism book, my interest in this whole topic kind of got sparked by Janet Mock's hashtag Girls Like Us. And so this is, I mean, and I say this in the book too, like we have to imagine Janet Mock before she was like super famous.
Janet Mock.
Janet Mock. Yeah. So when Janet Mock was doing things on Twitter and had just recently come out as trans, the Twitter world was so much more contracted in that you could actually have conversations with people on Twitter.
Yes.
Which is not the case now.
No.
Like we had real conversations, and so the relationship that developed there led to me asking, "Hey, I'm really interested in the hashtag Girls Like Us. How would you feel if I, did some research on it? Are there any research questions that you want to know?" And so through an article that I wrote about the hashtag, and then subsequently talking about it within the book hashtag activism, and now in Misogynoir Transformed, it's been a conversation that started and led to the research. And that to me felt much more ethical and in alignment with my principles and values, and especially dealing with a community that has been, so targeted and used. I mean, we're talking about the utility of Black women. Black trans women get used for so much. So I wanted to be as thoughtful about that as possible. And that was a real practice as well.
Yeah, well, I'm grateful for you for writing through that in the book, right? And not kind of pushing it off to somewhere else, but right front and center, being very direct and clear about how you did that work. It connects for me to something that you also talked about in the introduction about the general principle of harm reduction. And I almost did like a little happy dance when you were talking about harm reduction as like Black feminist praxis, because I think that we're hearing different kinds of ways of people imagining their Black feminism now that eradicate that as a strategy and as a really long-term historical strategy. So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit more about that praxis of harm reduction, how you drew historically to kind of come up with this idea, but also how do you see Black feminists in digital spaces still pursuing this strategy of harm reduction, even as there are naysayers kind of in the wings?
Yes. And I would say that also comes out of my interest in transformative justice.
Yeah.
And that's where the transformed comes from in the title as well. I'm really inspired by the work of Miriam Kaba and the workbook that she created with Shira Hassan, Fumbling Towards Repair. This has been a real model for me in thinking about harm reduction and how we want to relate to each other. Because I do think that given the world that we live in, currently what we can hope for is harm reduction.
Right.
It's going to take a lot for us to get to a new place. And I do think that that's possible. But in the interim, we've got to figure out how to be less harmful to each other, less harmful to ourselves. And one of the ways that I've seen Black women take that up in Black feminism has been just real practices of not self-care, but communal care, and thinking about the choices people make to create context of care that exist outside of formal structures. So, I mean, we can think about, Black families taking in siblings, children, etc., like these informal adoptions that happen in our community all the time as one way of reducing harm by not getting children into child protective services, which we know has been such a harmful place for our communities. And, if we think about drug use, not necessarily insisting that people stop self-medicating, but providing ways for people to self-medicate more with less risk.
Right.
So those practices have been, in my mind, really engineered and led by Black women, healthcare providers, nurses, clinicians, therapists, aunties, grandmas, etc. So those are the people who I really think model harm reduction, and it's just a practice that I think our communities have learned to use throughout time, and naming it as such, I think, gives us even more power to tap into it and to lift it up going forward.
Yeah. Something I love about your work generally, Moya, and the book specifically, is the care and attention that you do to naming practices. I mean, so obviously the titling of the book, what we just talked about with harm reduction, also your use of alchemy. And I just think it's such a brilliant use of a term, right? Because it gets us to think about the labor and the work. It gets us to think about who gets credit for work. It gets us thinking about who profits from work, how folks learn to do work, apprenticeship and tradition, what comes of the products they make. So I wondered if you could just ruminate for us on the use of that term and the idea of alchemy.
Yes. So my introduction to alchemy as a term is Patricia Williams' The Alchemy of Race and Rights. And I read that in graduate school in a course. And I remember thinking at the time, alchemy is such a specific word that in some ways I was like, this seems a little alienating for people who don't know what alchemy is. But it was, for me, a moment of like, oh, actually, part of using this term is trying to get people to dig deeper and to think about what happens when certain ideas come together. Alchemy is like that science, that pseudoscience of mixing things together and getting something better than what you had. And I definitely see myself connected to a legacy of like witchiness in my family. You know, for those who know, I'm like deep into astrology. So like there's something about alchemy that interests me, not just as a scholar, but as somebody who is on the planet, like trying to figure out how we move through the world. And so in the spirit of, you know, hashtag Black Girl Magic, shout out to Kashawn Thompson, like I do think that there's this way that alchemy describes what we create when, you know, we're given scraps. You know, an early iteration of this text had like, you know, I feel like we get like the chitlins of the internet and then we make a delicacy out of it, you know, like it's just, we get the things that are left over, but we still figure out how to use it to our benefit. And I think that that's a practice that a lot of people of color share. But for me, the digital alchemy of Black women and Black women who, or non-binary agender folks, part of that alchemy has been to use these platforms in ways that the people who created them never intended. And I think that's pretty awesome that we are able to build something from, you know, these things that are really trying to mine us for all of our data, that we can still extract something from that is pretty impressive.
It's so impressive. And I what I love about this wave of scholarship about Black digital practices, and I just see Andre Brock joining the chat. So, you know, this wave of books like yours, like Dr. Brock's book, that are allowing us to peer beyond the just word magic to the actual like long historical practices, the skill sets, the expertise, right? The technophilia, to use Anna Everett's term, right? of Black folks in these spaces. That's what this book, I think, gives us so well, is kind of the peer behind the curtain, right? So it's magic, but look at all of the labor, look at all of the play, look at all of the joy that's like kind of utilized to make this happen that we can see.
Absolutely. And again, leaving us with a sense that misogynoir, even as it is abhorrent, terrible, all of those things, that in spite of that, we are still able to transform it.
Yeah.
We are still able to move beyond it and imagine new worlds and live our lives in ways that support each other.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to skip like to the end and I'll come back, I swear. But just you talking about this idea of transforming worlds really reminds me, you know, toward the end of the book, as you're talking about that transformation process, and specifically as it related to like online web series, which I think is so interesting. We don't get enough writing about these really important web series that really shaped for so many of us our understanding of what was possible to do in digital spaces, what could be created. So thinking about these web series, I'm wondering about this notion of the incubation effect that you mentioned, of people using web series to kind of think through ideas, create new worlds for themselves. And it seems to me that like part of that possibility is about not having to create and not having to do the explanation for folks that this is not intended for, right? So like the ability to do this in this web series means that I'm not having to get it funded. I'm not having to meet a white audience. I'm not having to explain things that I would there. And that allows this freedom to do this other thing. But I wonder with the incubator, you mentioned Issa Rae's, you know, misadventures and how that kind of leads to this huge career for her with Insecure. What is lost when we lose the incubator of the web series? You know, what?
So much lost.
Yeah.
So much lost. I mean, I said this in another context, and I thought it was an unpopular opinion, but I think it was shared at the time. But I was like, Misadventures of Awkward Black Girl is a much better show than Insecure to me. Yeah. And that I think what gets lost is that need for translation, people feeling like there are other audiences that you need to speak to, as opposed to the ones that are already there and already understand. And of course, this doesn't mean that web series are perfect, you know, and that they're utopic. I mean, one of the things I go into a lot is how some of those same oppressive systems of the same structural oppression that we experience in mainstream media still finds its way into these web series, because we are products of the world that we live in. But when we go mainstream, I do think that there's a risk in not telling the story as authentically as we do when it's online, and being able to react to fans and have that real connection with your audience also shifts when you move to a larger platform, because no longer are the fans and you in direct conversation. It's also mediated by the corporation that is producing the project, and their ideas often, you know, shape so many things. I mean, even Issa Rae has talked about, you know, some of the decisions that were attempting to be made in terms of work that she was doing, and trying to hire a lighter actress for certain characters, or things that we see that take away the I don't know, the diversity that could be in a narrative, because once it gets polished with that mainstream glow, there's a lot of everydayness that can be written out of what made it interesting to people in the first place.
It's so interesting, right? Because it's the everydayness that captivates us, and it's what ends up getting written out when the the
Absolutely.
banality, right? It's just the, this is just how life unfolds that we're actually more interested in seeing, it appears, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So you said something there that was about fandom, so I'm going to make a stretch. And I love the piece where you're talking about Tumblr and microblogging. And this chapter was where my, internet studies ears really perked up when we were starting to think about the affordances of these platforms for doing the kind of work that you describe, particularly as it relates to notions of fandom, right? And so why do fandoms pop up in places like Tumblr versus places like Twitter, right? So what is the difference in these platforms? So I wonder what you think of fan studies and those who use that as a site, and also people who are using places like Tumblr as sites for activism and resistance. What do you think these two kinds of scholars can say to each other? What should they be sharing as they study these platforms that oftentimes they aren't? What affordances are right for both in these spaces?
Yeah. Oh, such good questions, Catherine. So I'm thinking a lot about this because one of the things I say about writing about Tumblr is that it was easier to do because the platform tanked.
Yeah.
So all of the people that I loved on there aren't there anymore.
Right.
The platform itself is not what it used to be. So I think the demise made it easier for me to talk about because it wasn't something I was actively participating in anymore.
Gotcha.
And I think fan studies has that similar question of the ebb and flow of people's relationship to their shows, to the object of their fandom. There's a real way that the things that we see in a show are shaped by our own experiences, the time in which we're viewing it, etc. So one thing I would say is being attentive to time and just the temporal dimension is something that I would want internet studies scholars and fan studies folks to talk about, because there is something interesting too about when people enter a fandom.
Yeah.
Like, were you there at the beginning?
Right.
Did you come in later?
Yeah.
Also, similarly, when did you get interested in Tumblr? Were you there at the beginning? And I'm doing also a podcast series where I'm talking to people about how they're transforming misogynoir in their lives, or their own history in relationship to their digital presence. And one of the people I interviewed mentioned that in those early days, Tumblr, Blogger, it was like writing letters. It was a little bit like pen pals.
Oh, I love that.
And I'm like, that is so accurate and also very different from the social media world we're in now. And that it changed so quickly in the course of 10 years is really shocking, because the Twitter of before, the Tumblr of before, led to real deep connections that I feel like people who are entering Twitter now, like, that's just not the way people connect to each other.
It's not what they're there for. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
So I do think that there's a real conversation for fan studies folks and internet studies folks to have about what do we think about time when people enter into a fandom or a platform, and how does that shape their experience? Because that definitely, to me, seems to be one of the many ways that those experiences can be similar.
Absolutely. Yeah, I also heard you reference podcasts, which, makes me think about Sarah Florini's work on podcasts as enclave spaces, right? To use Catherine Squire's terms, and that seems to be the same description you're giving for early Twitter, but also for Tumblr, right? Like this kind of public yet private space, right? That occupies this away from wandering eyes and, captivating community discourse and in a safe kind of environment. And so I'm wondering, if podcasting as Dr. Florini's argued, is taking some of that space up? Or are there other places where you've seen this pop up more recently, where specifically Black feminists and or Black women and Black non-binary and agender folks have found these collective kind of semi-private spaces to do the same kind of work that they were doing on Tumblr, or were doing in the early days of Twitter, or were doing at the Crunk Feminist Collective? Where is it happening now?
I think someone said this, and I think that it's true, and also unfortunate. I think those places are actually pretty private now.
Yeah.
And then I would say that it's happening in the group text.
It goes down now, right?
It's all in the group text. Yeah. Like there does not seem to be that semi-public space that feels like you can ask questions and learn, and also have people challenge you, but not challenge you in a way that, denies you your humanity. And like, I'm real sensitive about the language of cancel culture. So I'm not necessarily trying to talk about that, but I do think that we are in a moment where people, want to respond in such a way that things are, people respond in such a way that there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer. Right. And in those early days of Tumblr, people were more curious, and people would...
We were all messing up together too, right?
That too. That too.
Yeah.
That too. Yes.
I think about that with blogging communities, right? Like the kind of repertoire that bloggers had with regular readers, and the comment sections on, your favorite blogs were like lit, right? It was, everyone was in conversation. You posted something, but if I disagreed, I could say that, and we could talk about it in this really kind of familial way, because we knew other folks weren't watching. And
exactly. Yeah. And there was an expectation that would happen, that there would be a conversation.
Mm-hmm. There was. I mean, I think people posted with the expectation that you had to get back involved. This wasn't an end-all, be-all statement into the world. And you're right. A lot of things have culturally shifted in these last 10 to 15 years that place us and place the work that folks are doing online in different contexts. So I didn't have this question down, but since we're here, I mean, a lot of this, it seems like, is tied to like online branding and the ability to be profitable from our online work. And so that's something I'm really interested in thinking through in my work. And so I'm wondering your thoughts on how that has changed the utility of digital spaces to do kind of revolutionary work, to do that kind of resistance work. It also has to be the place where I make my money, right? Like I have to also be a brand.
This is so... You're asking all of the things that I feel like I can talk about. No, because I do think it to me is also in line with how we think about the nonprofit industrial complex. What does it mean for us to be working jobs that are supposed to support movements to basically, try to bring about a new world?
Yeah.
So in that sense, I feel like there's only so much a nonprofit can do, because it is designed to deal with the system as it exists, and it is trying to plug holes, etc. So similarly, with this move to like becoming a brand, a digital brand, the critique of the platforms, the critique of the system itself, I think it's a little lost. And, it makes sense to me how this happened, right? Because, okay, we can't get the government to do what we want it to do with our tax dollars. We'll become a nonprofit, and then we'll use that money to do what we want. But of course, there are lots of strictures on that. Yeah. Similarly, I am saying these things out into the world, but journalists, academics are biting my stuff and getting paid off of my intellectual property.
Yeah.
Like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to monetize it. I'm going to monetize myself and become a brand. And I worry about that. You know, there was a moment early on where people were like, aren't you going to trademark Misogynoir? And I was like, trademark it? Like, that just seems so wild to me. like there was an idea that I should be profiting off of this intellectual property.
Yeah.
And even the idea of intellectual property, I think, is one that needs to be questioned. So not that, you know, people who are creating things shouldn't get compensated for their work,
right?
But why is it that we need to get compensated? Like, it seems like we've missed that larger question of how do we break down capitalism and the idea that this is how we pay for our lives is through making, you know, writing, etc., in a way that generates money.
I mean, I love this, right? It's such a through thread from, for me anyway, it's a through thread from hip hop feminism and the notion of like shades of gray, right? This is so messy because simultaneously we can articulate that, yes, you have to pay me for my labor because unfortunately I exist within a capitalist superstructure. And because I do, I'm not going to work for free. Exactly. As particularly as a Black woman, I'm not going to work for free. But then also, how do we, at the same time as we're doing that, see the larger forest, right? Do we say that this structure is not our end goal? And do we kind of push back against that structure while embracing it in some ways for the sake of paying our bills, for the sake of, you know, keeping our jobs? It's tricky, right?
This is exactly my question. I saw Kung Lee and Jillian and Danielle and some folks who are part of we started this thing, Death Doulas for Capitalism. And I think we're trying to think through that question really seriously. So, you know, one foot in the world as it exists, and then 1 foot in the realm of possibility of when this all falls down. Because I think it's coming. I think it's coming.
Oh yeah. I mean, definitely. So I'm thinking about, I just want to sit with this for a while, but I know we have other things to talk about. But I mean, I think that this really speaks to me about the kind of different platforms that you talk through, and particularly the work you do in interviews at the end of the book, right? Talking to Antoinette Myers about MySpace and about feelings in Tumblr, right? And so it seems like folks are really describing to you the ability to manage their own and create their own space, and the loss that exists when you're no longer able to do that, and are now a part of a different tool or a different platform that's asking you to do that. You have to bring something else to that space. Yes. So I'm wondering, you know, as we think about the kind of counter public discourse that's happening on Twitter, the hate speech, the vitriol, and people being either forced into that space now or deciding to opt out, how do you think that you see Black users kind of changing or making modifications on newer platforms going forward? I mean, it seems like there was that brief window with what was the chat room that was like with video. That was I never started it. I never got an account, so I'm losing my internet studies.
Video or audio? The Clubhouse thing? No.
Clubhouse. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Okay, Clubhouse. Yes. So, I mean, it seemed like there was a moment with Clubhouse where that was happening, and it's already started to fizzle like very quickly, as they do. But what are we looking for as, are we left with group chat? Are there going to be other ways that we can continue to utilize these spaces where it feels like there's some ownership, even when we're not technically the owners of the space?
I mean, I do think that we're so good at adapting. So I know that we will find space. We will find our, you know, maroon landing sites, a respite, you know, whatever the platform is. Mm-hmm. So I'm not worried about that, but I am worried about our ability to even access the platforms as this question of net neutrality remains unresolved. Like, I do think internet service providers are slowly moving to that place of making us pay more for higher speeds.
Yeah.
That there's going to be a real division between people who can afford to pay that and those who can't. There's already a division between, which we've seen because of COVID, for young people who, yeah, they have a smartphone, but trying to do your math homework on your smartphone as opposed to a computer, like those things are wild. Like it's not the same. So it's such a real question that we need to have answered. And part of the question that I ask of Danielle and Antoinette is, you know, what would an ideal platform look like? And I think it becomes a question of us creating the platforms that we need, creating something that exists outside of this practice. So I am really interested in trying to think through what can we create outside of those systems. And that's what I hope to do in my new position at Northwestern and the Digital Humanities Apothecary Lab that I am starting. Yeah.
Love that. No, it's so exciting. I mean, I love that part of the book as well, this idea of what would an ideal space look like. And I feel like we have glimpses of that. We'll see someone like throw in this should have this feature, or Twitter doesn't have this feature, or this doesn't have that feature. But you're absolutely right. We need to like really think through something entirely different and what it would look like and how we would make that manifest. That's such an exciting project. I can't wait to see what comes out of the lab. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Well, first, actually, let's go to the question, because I think that there was a question for us that's related to what we're talking about now. So Danielle Cole asked the question, how do folks like myself and many other Black women navigate these online spaces that are large, like Facebook and Twitter, where we are post-blocked and denied access to mainstream posting?
So this is something that I know Danielle has had to deal with entirely too much. Not just Danielle, but so many people who are trying to call out the racist, misogynoir, the transphobia, homophobia that they're experiencing, that what happens when you do that is you call attention to yourself, and then the platform ends up blocking you. I think that is all the more reason for us to create what it is that we need, and for these platforms to do more work in terms of who they hire and who is advising them about how these platforms work. They're asking those questions, but of course they're not asking or addressing them quickly enough. But I do think that it's creating opportunities for us to say, we've had enough. And we want our own lane, because this one is not treating us the way that we deserve to be treated.
Yeah, absolutely. Please keep dropping questions. I know we're hit the hour mark, so I'll probably ask like another question or two, and then I think we'll see if there's any other questions that folks have. There was just this piece in the book about Jenna Taklakova. Did I say that?
Yeah.
That I thought was so interesting. And really, this was chapter 2, I think, right? Where you were kind of describing Janet Mock's activism in this regard. And this case, though, I think brings up so many interesting questions about femme presentation. And it reminded me of a conversation that Laverne Cox had with Bell Hooks at the New School some years back.
Yes. I remember this.
Oh, wow. Wasn't that something? And where basically, and you can correct me if I'm mischaracterizing, where Bell Hooks was critiquing the femme performativity of Laverne Cox's hair and heels. And, this set a lot of us in a very interesting place of critique for that. But Cox obviously was arguing that occupying a non-normative gendered body to begin with was transgressive itself, and therefore femme gender display is therefore transgressive. So her assertion was to challenge Black feminists, cis Black feminists, right, to consider that feminist constructs like the male gaze were constructed with cis women in mind, right? Like that this entire construct that so many people talk about and work through was not thought of in a context of a welcoming idea for both cis and trans women. So in your book, in chapters 1 and 2, you're brilliantly talking about how Black trans women's womanness is constantly questioned, ridiculed, and used as unjustifiable reasons for violence against their bodies. It seems to me that the implication here is that Black cis women, we should be the ones who recognize this most apparently, as our bodies are sites of inquiry and fraught with people and ownership, et cetera, right? Perhaps more than any other group, and should be firm allies in this space. Do you see Black cis women taking up this fight online in really productive ways and making this connection and using digital tools to resist alongside Black trans women?
Oh, so this is one of the conversations that I feel like we need to have, like we need a whole year in series on this, because in some ways I think there has been a lot of alignment between femme trans women, femme queer women, and also cis Black women. Like that there's a way that they can see each other as connected. So I think that there is an idea that, like, people can see, there's a way that I have seen cis heterosexual women see Janet Mock or see Laverne Cox in a way that perhaps they don't see a non-binary femme presenting person or a non-binary trans masculine person. I do think that there's something there. Like there's a way that, and I don't want to, there's a way that, like, pretty privilege and looking in ways that are recognizable by the male gaze, whether you're seeking that or not, still creates a level of alignment that I think we need to discuss. At the same time that, cis het women might still feel a way if their man, was attracted to a Black trans woman. I mean, we've seen this happen. I mean, speaking of Insecure, like, was that not this part of the
promise, right?
Yeah. So, like, there's this narrative about who you can be attracted to and also how you look, how that sets up connection and creates disconnect. So I really want us to do some more work to unpack all of these tensions, because I still think, like, there's some, I don't know, friction between Black women across gender, across sexuality, and it needs to be, I mean, that's just going to be a long conversation,
road, right?
Yeah, we have a long road to go. Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm inspired. I wanted to stop short of that, but that was the first word that came to mind. With some of the productive conversations that I've seen more recently in that space. And my hope is that, like, this digital context is allowing for folks to see more and understand more and have those productive conversations. But as we all know, it also does the opposite, right? It does. It's always doing both at the same time. It's always also propagating harmful stereotypes and putting negative ideas in folks' minds about who people are and what their capacities are. So both and, right? Always both
and that takes me to kind of the way I start, which is not to conflate like Black feminists with Black women, not to conflate, Black women with cis and heterosexual. Like, there are so many of those things that get aligned. Like, not all trans women are feminists. Not all cis women are feminists.
That's right.
And so when we're thinking about how people are relating to their gender, how they're relating to their sexuality, I think we have to dig a little bit deeper, because we can, even in our outlier status regarding gender or sexuality, still replicate and still perform the same kinds of, toxic behaviors that we see in more dominant groups.
Yeah. I think you talked about this wonderfully, and I promise I'm going to wrap, because we can just talk. We can just talk elsewhere. Everyone doesn't have to stay for hours. But you talked about this in certain online creators, certain content creators, proximity to femininity, male content creators, right? Their proximity to, we have cis men who have a proximal location of femininity and using that in this context of drag, right? And what that looks like. And I think there's a whole conversation to be had about TikTok and that right now, right? To think about how people are performing and replicating Black women in that space in ways that are causing a lot of harm to a lot of folks. I'm going to see if there are any final questions, though, because I know we've already gone a bit past our hour. This has been such a productive conversation for me. I just love to be in conversation with you and think through these ideas together. I hope we can do it again.
Well, I mean, I think we are doing it again, right? Do you want to say anything about?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I do have this book thing that I did, but I won't hear about that.
I mean, I feel like this is a perfect segue so people know to come back.
So we're press buddies. And so I have a book called Digital Black Feminism that is up for pre-order now on NYU's site. But I'm hoping to be back in this space with you to talk about digital Black feminism later this fall and just continue some of these conversations. There's so much connection between our work, and I just think it's such a privilege to get to talk to you about this book. I appreciate you inviting me so much.
Yes. Thank you so much.
So is ER still here? Can we toss back?
Yes. So, yes, thank you for that. And everybody be on the lookout for part 2, basically the mirror image of this conversation, in celebration of Catherine's book, because we're really excited about that. So, folks can click this teal button at the bottom of their screen to buy Misogynoir Transformed. Even if you already have a copy for yourself, you might want one for your community's library or a young scholar in your life. It really does help us when you buy the book from Charis, helps us pay for these programs. You can also make a donation to Charis Circle, our nonprofit. Any donation of any amount really does help us to fund this platform and to do this work. So we really do appreciate it. We have a great month of programs coming up in June. We would love, if you are new to Charis, for you to join us over at charisbooksandmore.com to learn more about that. You can just check out our calendar. It is Pride Month, even though Atlanta celebrates Pride in October. We take the opportunity to celebrate Pride twice. So June is a great full queer month of events, and we'd love for folks to check that out with us as much as possible. Thanks to our friends ZAMI NOBLA for always holding it down and co-sponsoring wonderful events with us. And thank you to both of y'all for this wonderful and generative conversation. It's always, it feels, extra special to get to celebrate the books of people who have come through Charis, who have been longtime friends, and Atlanta folk. Atlanta still claims you, even though many other places claim you at this point too. But
I still claim Atlanta, to be honest. I don't think that's going to change.
That's good. So this feels like a special hometown reunion, and the chat is so lovely and so full of love for you. So thanks to everybody watching at home, and I hope that you're safe and well, and that eventually we'll get to celebrate this book in person. So we'll have a do-over at some point and gather together in physical space. But until then, take care and be on the lookout for the YouTube video, which will be up in probably 36 hours, and I'll tweet that link out. That'll have captions with it.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Good night, everyone.